11. Under the stage lights, Diana Ross has always looked like certainty itself. A woman who could step into any room and make the air rearrange around her. The kind of legend people swear they grew up with even if they only heard her through a radio crackle in the backseat of a car. But the most unsettling thing about long-lasting icons is not what they accomplish in public. It is what they manage to keep private while the world thinks it knows them. Because for decades, the story of Diana Ross has been sold as an uninterrupted ascent, a queen rising from Detroit grit into Motown royalty, then into film, then into a global brand so durable it can survive time itself. Yet the closer you stand to that shine, the more you notice how tightly it is held together, like a smile, maintained a fraction of a second too long, like a voice that never wavers because wavering was never allowed. There's a question that hangs behind her greatest songs, a question that doesn't fit the music's promise, but follows it anyway. What did it cost to stay that composed, that adored, that untouchable for so long? And what if the cost was not just exhaustion, not just loneliness, not just the ordinary heartbreaks that come with fame, but an entire parallel life built on silence, carried day after day, year after year, until silence becomes a second skin? Imagine the arithmetic of it, the impossible math of celebrity. To be constantly seen while also constantly hiding, to give people an image they can worship while protecting a truth that could fracture everything if it ever escaped. For roughly 30 years, the narrative suggests that was her daily reality, not a single shocking moment, but a long discipline of containment, the kind that reshapes a person from the inside out. A secret is never just a secret when you're famous. It is a living thing that demands space, demands strategy, demands a new version of you that can function under pressure without revealing the strain. And pressure was the one constant in her life. The pressure of proving you belong, proving you deserve the spotlight, proving you can keep delivering even when your body begs for rest and your heart begs for somewhere safe to land. She came from Detroit, from a world where security could vanish overnight, where dignity was learned in small acts, in showing up, in holding yourself upright when nobody was looking out for you. That early instability, however it is described in different tellings, points to the same emotional blueprint. A child learns that comfort is not guaranteed, so control becomes a kind of prayer. Later, the control becomes performance, and then performance becomes survival. Motown did not just polish young talent. It engineered icons, and engineering requires sacrifice. The Supremes era is remembered in numbers and milestones, but behind the milestones is a brutal rhythm. Rehearsals that erase sleep, tours that swallow months, expectations that do not soften when you are tired, only sharpen when you are successful. And success, for someone positioned at the center, can become its own trap, because once the world believes you're the strongest, you lose permission to be human. Now, place a private truth inside that machine, something that cannot be clarified, cannot be corrected, cannot be spoken without collateral damage. You begin to understand why an artist might build a life that looks serene from the outside, while quietly tightening from the inside. People love to say fame is a gift, but fame is also surveillance, and surveillance changes how you breathe. Every family photo becomes a negotiation. Every relationship becomes a narrative. Every joyful milestone is shadowed by the fear of what a single whisper could set on fire. That is where the phrase double life stops sounding like sensationalism and starts sounding like a clinical description of how you keep moving forward when honesty feels too dangerous. And then there are the moments when the mask slips, not because the person wants it to, but because the body reaches its limit. The story includes a public rupture in the early 2000s, when the discipline that had carried her through decades collided with an ordinary road, flashing lights, an illegal limit, and a humiliating truth that an image cannot hold you up when you are falling. It is easy to treat that as gossip, but it reads more like a symptom, the kind that appears when grief accumulates faster than you can metabolize it, when you keep choosing the stage because the stage is the only place you know how to stand when stopping feels like disappearing. This is the uneasy entrance into her story, not the glittering highlight reel, but the private ledger hidden behind it. The years of restraint, the weight of what could not be said, the careful choreography of motherhood, love, loyalty, and power in an industry that rarely allows women to be complicated without punishment. If you have ever felt comforted by her voice, this is the moment to listen differently, because the question is no longer how she became a legend, but what she had to carry, quietly, to remain one. Long before the world called her a queen, Diana Ross understood something far less glamorous and far more urgent. Invisibility is dangerous. Not metaphorically, not artistically, but socially and psychologically. Growing up in Detroit in the 1940s and 1950s meant learning early that stability could evaporate without warning. A working-class household, a father leaving before dawn for factory shifts, a mother holding the home together through illness and strain, siblings absorbing tension without language to explain it. When her mother fell gravely ill and the children were sent away for a time, something foundational shifted. Separation was no longer theoretical. It was embodied. No promises, no timeline, just absence. For a child, that kind of rupture plants a singular belief. You must learn to stand alone before anyone asks you to. When the family returned and moved into the Brewster Douglas housing projects, the lessons hardened. Thin walls carried arguments. Poverty did not scream, it lingered. Safety felt conditional. Ross would later describe music not as ambition, but as refuge. Singing did not require permission. It did not depend on a landlord, a paycheck, or a man's mood. It belonged to her. At Cass Technical High School, she studied fashion and cosmetology with the same intensity she gave to harmonies. Precision became habit. Beauty became discipline. A neighbor, Smokey Robinson, noticed the quiet focus beneath her composure and offered encouragement. But encouragement is not opportunity. Opportunity still required persistence, bordering on obsession. She and her friends, Florence Ballard, Mary Wilson, and Betty McGlown, formed the Primettes, performing wherever they could find a microphone. They were young, unpolished, and largely ignored. Rejection did not surprise Diana. It confirmed her worldview. When Berry Gordy initially dismissed her as too young, she did not retreat. She returned, again and again. Nearly a year of sweeping floors at Hitsville, running errands, standing in hallways, absorbing everything. She studied not just songs, but systems, who held authority, how records were chosen, how talent was framed. Even then, she was not merely auditioning for a contract. She was learning the architecture of power. When the Supremes finally secured their breakthrough in 1964 with Where Did Our Love Go, it was framed as a Cinderella moment. What the headlines did not capture was the fragility beneath it. 8 prior singles had failed. They were mockingly labeled the no-hit Supremes. The industry's affection is conditional. The same press that crowns you will quietly bury you if momentum falters. Success did not bring relief. It brought escalation. Between 1964 and 1967, the Supremes generated 12 #1 singles. Television appearances multiplied. Tours expanded. Dresses became more elaborate. Expectations became merciless. Diana, selected as lead, carried both visibility and suspicion. Within the group, dynamics shifted. Outside it, whispers grew louder. Favoritism, manipulation, ambition mistaken for betrayal. When the group was renamed Diana Ross and the Supremes, the hierarchy became official. Florence Ballard's frustration deepened. The bond that had once felt communal began to strain under spotlight heat. This is where the double life begins to crystallize. On stage, Diana projected poise, gliding, radiant, seemingly untroubled. Offstage, she absorbed tension that had no safe outlet. Being first, she would later admit, meant never being allowed to falter publicly. Fatigue was weakness. Doubt was private. Loneliness was irrelevant. The machine demanded delivery, and she delivered. Her 1970 solo debut with Ain't No Mountain High Enough solidified her independence. But independence did not equate to freedom. It intensified scrutiny. Each success had to outperform the last. Film offered new terrain. Her portrayal of Billie Holiday in Lady Sings the Blues was not a vanity project. It was a calculated risk that could have dismantled her career. Instead, it earned her an Academy Award nomination and a Golden Globe. Triumph, once again. Yet triumph added another layer of expectation. Meanwhile, behind the public assent, a private entanglement complicated everything. Berry Gordy was not simply a producer. He was an architect of her rise. Their romantic relationship existed inside a structure of power imbalance and professional dependency. When her daughter Rhonda was born in 1971, the truth of paternity, Gordy as father, could not coexist comfortably with public narrative. Diana married Robert Ellis Silverstein, a decision framed as romance, but functioning equally as protection. Protection for a child. Protection for a career. Protection for a brand that had no tolerance for scandal. For 13 years, Rhonda grew up without full knowledge of her biological father. Publicly, the family appeared cohesive. Privately, silence required maintenance. Silence is labor. It demands vigilance at gatherings, careful language in interviews, controlled emotion during milestones. Imagine celebrating birthdays while calibrating every glance. Imagine gratitude for a husband who loved a child unconditionally while knowing part of the foundation rests on omission. The cost was not explosive drama. It was cumulative pressure. Each achievement, every award, every sold-out venue, carried an unspoken weight. Was her prominence purely talent or proximity to Gordy? The question lingered externally and internally. For Florence Ballard, already feeling displaced, favoritism narratives deepened resentment. Ballard's eventual dismissal and tragic early death at 32 cast a long shadow. Diana never publicly assigned blame, but assent had clearly required separation. The double life was not about deception in the sensational sense. It was about containment in the structural sense. She had learned as a child that security is temporary. Now she learned as an icon that visibility is volatile. To protect what she loved, she compartmentalized. To preserve momentum, she minimized vulnerability. To remain the Queen of Motown, she accepted isolation as collateral. When Rhonda finally learned the truth at 13, Diana described it as watching innocence shift in real time. Honesty brought relief, but also confrontation. The secret that had structured so many decisions could no longer hide in plain sight. Integration began, but integration does not erase history. By the late 1970s, her first marriage collapsed quietly, not in explosive scandal, but in exhaustion. A home built partly on protection could not indefinitely sustain intimacy. To the public, it was another celebrity divorce. To Diana, it was the unraveling of a structure she had once believed necessary. If part MOT asked what it cost to remain composed, part high reveals the arithmetic. Fame magnified ambition. Power complicated love. Protection required silence. And silence, over time, reshaped identity. She was not living two lives because she desired duplicity. She was living two lives because survival inside that level of scrutiny demanded it. If the first two acts of Diana Ross's life were built on discipline and containment, the third begins where containment starts to fracture. Not suddenly, not theatrically, but through the quiet erosion of the very bonds she once believed ambition could not touch. Success had already required distance from her group. Secrecy had already reshaped her marriage. Now another form of loss entered, one that cut deeper because it involved chosen family rather than contracts or headlines. By the early 1980s, Diana Ross was no longer merely a Motown star. She was an institution, a solo powerhouse, a global name that did not require explanation. Her album Diana had dominated charts. Endless Love with Lionel Richie became an anthem. A record-breaking contract with RCA confirmed her commercial authority. On paper, this was the era of consolidation. But consolidation at that level does not create ease. It amplifies pressure. Every move carries financial implications. Every relationship becomes entangled with perception. It was during this period that she became involved with Gene Simmons, the magnetic and controversial bassist of Kiss. The relationship itself, viewed in isolation, could be dismissed as a celebrity romance between two high-profile figures navigating fame. But nothing in Diana's life existed in isolation. The complication lay in its origin. Simmons had been romantically linked to Cher, Diana's close friend, confidant, and emotional ally during years when the spotlight had grown colder. Cher was not simply another celebrity acquaintance. She was a witness to Diana's private strain, a woman who understood what it meant to stand under relentless public scrutiny while trying to preserve something authentic offstage. When Simmons developed feelings for Diana before fully disentangling himself from Cher, the damage was not explosive. It was structural. Trust did not collapse in public confrontation. It thinned in silence. There were no dramatic interviews, no public feuds, just distance. Phone calls unanswered. Invitations declined. A sisterhood quietly dissolving. The loss of Cher did not dominate headlines, but it altered something essential in Diana's emotional landscape. If ambition had separated her from Florence, if secrecy had strained her first marriage, now desire cost her a friend who had offered loyalty without agenda. Diana would later end the relationship with Simmons. But endings do not rewind beginnings. Even after romance fades, consequence remains. The fracture reinforced a pattern that had been developing for years. Ascent required trade-offs, and the trade-offs increasingly involved intimacy. It is tempting to interpret this phase as personal miscalculation, but it is more precise to call it emotional fatigue. When a person spends decades performing resilience, they begin to crave intensity that feels unscripted. Simmons represented volatility, rawness, unpredictability, the opposite of the meticulously managed world Diana inhabited. But unpredictability carries risk. And in this case, risk came at the expense of sisterhood. While that relationship dissolved, another chapter opened that briefly appeared to offer stability. In 1986, she married Norwegian shipping magnate Arnaz Jr. The wedding in Switzerland was radiant, almost cinematic. For the first time in years, Diana allowed herself to publicly describe love in expansive terms. She called him the greatest love of her life. And for a time, that declaration seemed credible. With Naz, she entered a different social sphere. European high society, quieter luxury, a rhythm less frantic than the American entertainment machine. They had 2 sons together, Ross and Evan. She embraced his 3 older children as her own. The family moved between London, the Alps, and Connecticut, creating what looked from the outside like a long-awaited sanctuary. But sanctuary, for someone accustomed to vigilance, is fragile. Even within stability, touring continued. Diana's identity had never been separable from performance. She did not know how to exist outside of forward motion. And forward motion, even in marriage, introduces absence. Absence introduces space. And space invites strain. The mid-1990s delivered a blow that neither wealth nor marriage could buffer. In 1996, while on tour in Japan, Diana received news that her younger brother Arthur, T-Boy Ross, had died. Distance became unbearable arithmetic. She could not immediately return home. She could not say goodbye. The funeral required her presence, but the grief required something more primal than public composure. It is in moments like these that the double life becomes almost unbearable. To stand on stage in sequins while privately collapsing. To smile under lights hours after receiving irreversible news. Audiences experience transcendence. The performer experiences fragmentation. She later described smiling in diamonds while drowning in shadows. That line is not poetic flourish. It is clinical truth. 3 years later, another humiliation unfolded, this time publicly. In 1999, Diana learned through Norwegian television, not from her husband, that Arnaz Jr. was announcing their separation. A marriage she had believed stable dissolved through broadcast rather than conversation. Reports of another woman followed. For someone who had already structured her life around protection and containment, public abandonment cut differently. Divorce at 56 is not scandal in itself. But for Diana, it represented repetition. A home once presented as resolution revealed itself as impermanent. The narrative of finally resting collapsed. And then, in 2004, tragedy intensified. Arnaz Jr. died in a mountaineering accident in South Africa. Though they were divorced, the grief did not follow legal technicalities. He had been partner, father of her sons, a symbol of her attempt at lasting sanctuary. His death forced her to mourn both the man and the version of herself who had believed stability was secured. By this point, the ledger of loss had thickened. Florence Ballard gone. Mary Wilson eventually gone. Brother gone. Marriage collapsed. Former husband dead. Friendship fractured. The public image, however, remained luminous. The 1990s and early 2000s still saw tours, honors, cultural recognition. But the private architecture was strained. Grief unprocessed does not disappear. It metabolizes slowly or it numbs. In Diana's case, numbness began to manifest in ways that would later surface dramatically. Alcohol, initially a brief anesthetic, gradually blurred the boundary between coping and collapse. This is where the concept of a double life shifts from emotional secrecy to psychological survival. For decades, she had mastered compartmentalization. But compartments, when overloaded, leak. The years leading into the early 2000s show the first unmistakable cracks in the system she had built to endure everything. Yet even amid accumulating fracture, she continued to work, continued to perform, continued to appear untouchable. Because the most dangerous myth in celebrity culture is that strength equals immunity. Diana Ross was strong, but strength, extended too long without restoration, becomes brittle. By the time flashing police lights would later interrupt her control, the groundwork had already been laid. The collapse was not sudden. It was cumulative. It was the inevitable result of decades spent holding together brilliance and silence, loyalty and ambition, love and containment. Part B ends here, at the edge of rupture. The next chapter will confront the public breaking point, the arrest, the humiliation, the confrontation with self, and the unexpected way legacy began to rebuild from fracture rather than perfection. By the early 2000s, the discipline that had once defined Diana Ross began to feel less like strength and more like strain. For decades, she had outrun instability with performance. When grief struck, she toured. When marriage faltered, she worked. When friendships fractured, she moved forward. Motion had always been her refuge. But motion cannot metabolize sorrow forever. Eventually, the body interrupts what the mind refuses to acknowledge. After her divorce from Arnaz Jr., the structure she had briefly believed in dissolved into something colder. Public announcements, headlines, speculation, these were familiar pressures. What was different now was exhaustion. She was no longer the 20-something Supremes, lead pushing past doubt. She was a woman in her late 50s carrying accumulated loss, a brother buried without goodbye, a marriage publicly undone, the lingering guilt of fractured friendships, the weight of a secret long carried, and the relentless expectation to remain luminous. Alcohol entered not as rebellion, but as relief. A quiet sedative, a way to lower the volume when applause faded and rooms grew too still. For someone who had spent a lifetime calibrating every public gesture, surrendering control, even temporarily, can feel like oxygen. But oxygen can turn into dependency when used to avoid reflection. In May 2002, under pressure from family members who recognized what she struggled to admit, Diana entered Promises, a rehabilitation facility in Malibu. The decision itself signaled vulnerability. For the first time, the narrative was not about endurance, but intervention. Yet even there, the tension between stage and stillness persisted. Treatment requires surrender to process. Stardom resists surrender. She left early, returning to performance commitments that had defined her identity for decades. But the cycle was not finished. By August of the same year, she re-entered treatment. The repetition revealed something important. This was no publicity stunt. It was confrontation. Still, confrontation without complete withdrawal from the machinery of fame remains fragile. Tours resumed. Appearances continued. And beneath them, instability lingered. Then came December 30th, 2002. On a dark stretch of road in Tucson, Arizona, flashing police lights cut through the night. Her car had drifted. Breathalyzer readings registered nearly twice the legal limit. The arrest was clinical, routine, procedural. Yet symbolically, it detonated 40 years of image control in a single sequence of footage. There are few things more destabilizing for a legend than public vulnerability stripped of glamour. Mugshots do not flatter. Court appearances do not choreograph dignity. She spent 2 days in jail. Probation followed. Fines were imposed. The numbers were manageable. The humiliation was not. For someone whose identity had been built on composure, the experience forced an unfiltered encounter with self. No stage lighting. No sequin armor. No microphone to redirect emotion into melody. Just a cell, a bench, and silence that did not applaud. She later admitted she had been falling apart and did not know how to stop performing. That admission reframes the arrest not as moral failure, but as structural collapse. When a person equates visibility with survival, stepping away feels existentially threatening. Yet continuing at full speed while internally depleted guarantees rupture. The days following the arrest were heavy with analysis. Media replayed footage. Commentators speculated. Fans expressed disappointment or concern. But beneath public reaction lay a more intimate reckoning. For Diana, the event represented the first time control had failed so visibly. Not in whispers, not in contained family revelations, but under law enforcement lights. And still, the story does not pivot into disappearance. That would have followed a predictable arc: scandal, retreat, quiet fade. Instead, something else occurred. She returned. Returning did not mean denial. It meant recalibration. Performances resumed, but there was a perceptible shift. Less frantic proving, more deliberate presence. The voice carried history differently now. Applause no longer masked vulnerability. It coexisted with it. In 2004, tragedy compounded reflection when Arnaz Jr. died in a mountaineering accident. Despite divorce, the grief was not abstract. He was father to her sons, a chapter of her life that had once promised sanctuary. His death underscored something brutally simple. Even separation does not eliminate attachment. The accumulation of grief, scandal, and loss forced a question she had avoided for decades. Who am I when I am not performing survival? That question deepened in 2009 with the death of Michael Jackson. Their connection stretched back to Motown's early days, when she mentored and supported him, and the Jackson naming her as potential guardian of his children and his will spoke to trust beyond publicity. His death reopened wounds about visibility, vulnerability, and the illusion of invincibility. At this stage, the double life narrative transforms. It is no longer about secrecy alone. It becomes about integration. The earlier decades required concealment to protect family and career. The 2000s demanded transparency to protect self. The DUI arrest did not erase her legacy. It complicated it. It humanized it. It exposed the cost of relentless endurance. And in doing so, it marked a transition from image management to self-preservation. There's a difference between shining because you are untouched and shining because you have survived exposure. Diana Ross entered the latter category. The woman who once believed stopping meant vanishing began to understand that slowing could mean healing. By the time she stepped on his stages again, whether for charity concerts, legacy tours, or televised honors, there was less urgency in her posture. The songs still soared, but beneath them ran a steadier current. Not denial of fracture, acceptance of it. Part Bond closes not with redemption as spectacle, but with recovery as recalibration. The crown did not disappear. It settled differently. Recovery did not arrive for Diana Ross as a dramatic transformation or a single decisive moment. It came gradually, almost quietly, through repetition. Not the repetition of relentless touring that had once defined her peak years, but the repetition of choosing to remain present after humiliation, after grief, after exposure. The early 2000s had stripped away the illusion that discipline alone could hold everything together. What followed was not reinvention in the flashy sense, but reconstruction. The industry into which she returned had changed. Pop cycles moved faster. Younger artists dominated airwaves. Nostalgia had become a market category. For many performers of her era, this phase meant ceremonial appearances and graceful exits. But Diana did not position herself as a relic. She positioned herself as continuity. Collaborations signaled this shift. Appearances alongside artists from different generations were less about chasing relevance and more about reinforcing lineage. When she performed with Rod Stewart or later shared stages with contemporary acts, the message was subtle but firm. She was not seeking validation from the present. She was reminding it of its foundation. Albums like Blue and later releases were not commercial juggernauts in the way her Motown catalog had been. They were reflective, intimate. They suggested an artist no longer sprinting to outpace expectation, but settling into authorship of her own narrative. The urgency that once characterized her drive had softened into steadiness. Recognition followed in waves. Lifetime Achievement Awards accumulated. BET honored her impact on Black artistry. The Kennedy Center celebrated her contributions to American culture. The Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award acknowledged not just hit records, but structural influence. In 2016, she received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Each honor functioned less as applause for current output and more as acknowledgement of endurance. Endurance became the defining word. The woman who had once lived split between concealment and exposure began to inhabit something more integrated. She no longer had to deny past fractures. The public record included them. What mattered now was trajectory. Her tours in the 2010s and early 2020s reflected this recalibration. Performances were curated events rather than constant grind. The In the Name of Love tour and later the Thank You tour across the United Kingdom showcased not desperation to prove stamina, but celebration of longevity. When she appeared at Glastonbury, standing before vast fields of listeners, the symbolism was unmistakable. She was not competing with youth. She was embodying history. The songs carried different weight now. I'm Coming Out, once a declaration of independence within the industry, sounded like a declaration of survival. Ain't No Mountain High Enough transformed from romantic anthem to autobiographical statement. Lyrics written decades earlier resonated as testimony. The physicality of performance changed as well. Movement was measured. Breath was respected. Age was not concealed. It was integrated. This, too, marked evolution. For an industry notorious for punishing women for growing older, Diana Ross's presence in her 70s and 80s carried defiance without confrontation. She did not announce resilience. She demonstrated it. Offstage, her focus pivoted decisively toward family. Rhonda, Tracy, Chudney, Ross, and Evan were no longer children navigating secrecy and divorce. They were adults with their own identities. Grandchildren entered the picture, shifting her orientation from preservation to legacy. In interviews, she spoke less about charts and more about lineage, less about awards and more about continuity. This phase of life emphasized boundaries. Real estate investments were not spectacle but insulation. Homes designed for privacy, layered security, long driveways, spaces where applause could not intrude. The architectural choices mirrored emotional choices. After decades of exposure, she prioritized containment on her own terms. Health also became deliberate. Past struggles with eating disorders and alcohol were not erased from narrative. They were absorbed into a broader understanding of maintenance. Nutrition, rest, measured activity. These were not public branding strategies. They were survival strategies refined. Financially, her estimated net worth, often cited between $200 and $250 million, reflected 6 decades of accumulation rather than explosive windfalls. Catalog ownership, publishing rights, licensing agreements. These decisions suggested lessons learned from earlier eras when artists often surrender control. If the first half of her career was shaped by navigating power structures, the latter half emphasized autonomy within them. Philanthropy quietly extended her influence. Contributions toward education, arts initiatives, and programs serving Black youth connected back to her own origins in Detroit. The girl who once understood instability as a daily condition seemed intent on creating structural stability for others. Yet perhaps the most striking transformation was psychological. In earlier decades, silence had been strategy. In later years, acknowledgement replaced secrecy. When she spoke about difficult chapters, the DUI arrest, the strains of fame, her tone carried neither defensiveness nor dramatization. It carried recognition. Recognition that brilliance can coexist with fracture. Recognition that strength, when stretched too long, requires recalibration. Recognition that admiration elevates but does not shield. The double life that once defined her, public radiance paired with private containment, gradually integrated into a singular identity. She was no longer splitting herself between light and shadow. She carried both openly. One of the most symbolic moments of this era occurred when she appeared at the Met Gala draped in a gown embroidered with the names of her grandchildren. The gesture reframed glamour. It was no longer solely about spectacle. It was about lineage. Under camera flashes, she stood not as a performer protecting secrets, but as a matriarch displaying continuity. By this stage, admiration had transformed from burden into witness. It no longer demanded concealment. It acknowledged endurance. Part Nam does not end with perfection restored. It ends with recalibration achieved. Diana Ross did not escape consequence. She absorbed it. She did not erase humiliation. She integrated it. She did not outrun grief. She carried it forward. The next chapter will explore what remains when iconography settles into legacy. What wealth, property, and preservation reveal about a woman who has spent more than 60 years navigating the cost of being seen. By the time Diana Ross entered her 80s, the urgency that once defined her career had settled into something far more deliberate. She no longer needed to prove endurance. She embodied it. The industry that once dictated her rhythm now moved around her rather than ahead of her. Trends cycled. New stars emerged and faded. Yet her catalog remained active. Licensed, streamed, sampled, revived. Longevity became less about physical presence and more about cultural permanence. Her estimated net worth, often cited between $200 and $250 million, reflects not a single explosive era, but 6 decades of sustained negotiation with fame. That figure tells a story of catalog ownership, publishing rights, touring revenue, brand partnerships, and disciplined financial stewardship. But wealth in her case is less about luxury than insulation. After decades of exposure, insulation matters. Her former estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, symbolized that philosophy. Private acreage, long driveways, architecture designed to absorb rather than attract attention. Later California residences carried similar themes. Open light, warm materials, layered privacy. These homes were not monuments to excess. They were controlled environments, places where a woman who had spent most of her life under surveillance could decide when visibility ended. The same logic applied to lifestyle. The Rolls-Royces and Bentleys often associated with her image were rarely paraded as spectacle. They functioned as quiet transport. Efficiency, not exhibition. It is revealing that in recent years, her public appearances feel curated rather than constant. She does not chase the spotlight. She selects it. More significant than property or vehicles is how she structures her time. The frantic back-to-back schedule of the Supremes era has been replaced with measured pacing. Tours are shorter. Appearances are symbolic. Health routines are prioritized. Nutrition, rest, movement, these are no longer secondary to performance. They are central. Having once overridden her body's limits, she now listens to them. Her children and grandchildren anchor this stage of life. Rhonda, Tracy, Chudney, Ross, and Evan form a constellation that reframes success. Estate planning, trusts, and financial structures exist not to control wealth, but to prevent instability from repeating across generations. She has often suggested that legacy is not what survives you, but what grows beside you. In that sense, her focus has shifted from personal achievement to generational continuity. Philanthropy quietly reinforces this evolution. Contributions to arts education, racial equity initiatives, and youth programs connect back to the girl who once navigated Detroit housing projects with nothing but discipline and voice. These gestures are rarely theatrical. They're extensions of memory. She understands what institutional support can mean for young artists beginning without safety nets. Publicly, she continues to appear at pivotal cultural moments. Glastonbury, legacy tours across the UK and United States. Select televised events. Each performance now carries subtext. The notes are no longer just notes, they're documentation. Documentation that excellence can persist without urgency. Documentation that aging does not erase relevance. The symbolism of her 2025 Met Gala appearance captured this stage precisely. Draped in a feathered gown embroidered with the names of her grandchildren, she stood beneath flashbulbs that once might have triggered defensive composure. Instead, the moment felt testimonial, not defiance, not spectacle, recognition. She was not presenting glamour for validation. She was presenting lineage as evidence of endurance. There's a distinct psychological shift here. Earlier decades demanded splitting, public composure versus private concealment. Now, there is synthesis. The woman who once lived in containment has integrated fracture into identity. She no longer performs invincibility. She performs continuity. Even her interviews reflect this shift. When referencing past humiliation, the 2002 arrest, the collapses, the grief, her tone is measured. Not apologetic, not sensational, reflective. Reflection suggests processing. Processing suggests that the double life no longer governs her present. Her catalog continues to generate revenue long after initial release. Streaming platforms introduce her music to audiences who were not born when the Supremes dominated radio. Sampling in contemporary tracks repositions her voice inside modern soundscapes. Cultural memory becomes currency. Yet perhaps the most striking feature of this era is restraint. She does not flood the market with output. She does not overexpose herself in interviews. Scarcity, once enforced by exhaustion, is now chosen strategically. When she appears, it matters. Her life at this stage resembles a ledger balanced. The early instability that taught her vigilance has been replaced with deliberate stability. The secrecy that once shaped family structure has been acknowledged and integrated. The grief that once overwhelmed has been folded into narrative rather than avoided. Wealth remains. Recognition remains. But the emphasis has shifted from acquisition to preservation, from ascent to stewardship. Part Sow reveals a woman no longer divided by silence. The double life that once required constant negotiation has evolved into a single, layered existence. She stands not as an untouched icon, but as living documentation of what admiration demands and what endurance can rebuild. Only one chapter remains, the final reckoning. What does her story ultimately mean? What does it reveal about success, sacrifice, and the invisible cost of being seen? When people speak about Diana Ross now, they rarely begin with scandal. They begin with reverence, with legend, with icon, with the soundtrack of an era. But the final chapter of her story is not about reputation. It is about integration. For 30 years, she lived in compartments. Public brilliance, private containment, applause on stage, silence at home, strategic marriages, carefully managed narratives. Grief deferred until the lights went out. The double life was not theatrical deception. It was survival architecture. It was the structure that allowed her to rise in an industry, in a country, that demanded black women be extraordinary without ever appearing fragile. But the cost of that structure accumulated. Separation from Florence Ballard, distance from Mary Wilson, a friendship with Cher that never fully recovered, a marriage built partly on protection rather than transparency, a brother's funeral attended through emotional shock, a second marriage dissolved publicly, a DUI arrest that cracked decades of composure, the death of Arnaz Jr., the death of Michael Jackson. Each event added weight. The remarkable truth is not that she endured these fractures. Many people endure fracture. The remarkable truth is that she continued choosing visibility after being wounded by it. There's a difference between surviving fame and transcending it. Surviving means maintaining position. Transcending means reshaping meaning. In her later years, Diana Ross did not try to erase the complications of her past. She absorbed them into her narrative. The woman who once had to protect secrets at all costs began speaking about endurance without defensive tone. That shift marks the true transformation. Her legacy today is not built solely on the Supremes' 12 #1 hits, not solely on Lady Sings the Blues, not solely on awards, wealth, or tours. It rests on a quieter foundation, persistence without disappearance. For Black American women in particular, excellence often demands doubling. Twice the discipline, twice the control, twice the resilience. Vulnerability can be weaponized. Mistakes can be magnified. Success can be reframed as favoritism. Diana Ross navigated those pressures in real time, decades before conversations about systemic bias became mainstream discourse. She learned to perform in vulnerability because the alternative felt unsafe. The tragedy was not that she had secrets. The tragedy was that the system required secrecy to preserve opportunity. Yet in her 80s, she stands differently, not as a relic of glamour, but as testimony. She appears on stage not to prove she still can, but because she still chooses to. The applause that once felt interrogative now feels archival. Audiences are not asking whether she belongs. They are acknowledging that she built the platform on which others stand. Her wealth, often estimated between $200 and $250 million, is sometimes cited as evidence of triumph. But money does not erase memory. It does not undo nights of isolation. It does not reverse choices made under pressure. What it does represent is longevity. The financial accumulation mirrors artistic persistence. Both required showing up repeatedly when retreat would have been understandable. Perhaps the most revealing element of her final chapter is her orientation toward family. The names embroidered on gowns, the emphasis on grandchildren, the estate planning designed to prevent chaos. These are not decorative gestures. They're corrective ones. She spent decades stabilizing her own trajectory. Now she stabilizes the ground for those who follow. The question that lingers is not whether she made mistakes. Of course she did. The question is whether greatness requires cost. And if it does, who pays the highest portion of that cost? Diana Ross paid in secrecy, in strained sisterhood, in controlled emotion, in public humiliation, in accumulated grief. But she also converted those payments into cultural permanence. She did not shine because she was untouched. She shone because she carried weight without collapsing. That is the final image. Not a woman frozen in her Motown prime, not a headline about scandal, not even a medal ceremony. The final image is of a figure who understands the ledger of her life. Admiration on one side, sacrifice on the other, neither erased, both acknowledged. Success, her story suggests, is not the absence of fracture. It is the decision to continue after fracture. It is the courage to stand where fear once dictated silence. It is the refusal to let the most painful chapter define the final one. In the end, Diana Ross did not merely live a double life. She outgrew it. She integrated it. And she left behind not just songs, but a blueprint for endurance. If making it requires carrying something heavy, the deeper question becomes, what are you willing to carry and what are you unwilling to lose? Her answer was complicated, but it was undeniably lived.